Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Welcome. My name is Matt Koshin. I'm with the Rice Creek Watershed District. Thanks for joining me. We're going to be talking about stream meander restoration in a ditched urban creek. In this case, that creek is Rice Creek, and this was one of the larger meander restoration projects in Minnesota. So first off, thanks to some of our project partners. Kevin Bean and Mike Majeski were with EOR. They were the project designers and the project engineer. Joel Groten with the local USGS office did sediment collection in Rice Creek, both pre and post project. And Ramsey County Parks was the landowner. They were a great partner to work with. Funding for this project came from the Rice Creek Watershed District and a Clean Water Fund grant. So quick background, I'll talk a bit about project and goals, jump into project design and construction. We had some tricky construction on this project. And then finish up with some monitoring data. We have pre and post project monitoring data. So first off, some background and goals. For those that aren't familiar with the Rice Creek Watershed District, we're in the northern part of the metro area, kind of northern suburbs. Here we can see our project location. This is in the city of Arden Hills, adjacent Mounds View and Shore View. So Middle Rice Creek starts up in the chain of lakes, in Lino Lakes, and then moves down towards Long Lake. Long Lake has really severe water quality problems, hence our project in Middle Rice Creek to try and decrease sediment and nutrient loading. But then Rice Creek continues to the west out towards the Mississippi River. So here's again our project location. If you've driven on 35W before, you've driven over Rice Creek. Our project location is bounded by County Road I on the north and County Road H on the south. There's our project location. This is adjacent what used to be the Twin Cities Army Ammunition Plant. Now it's Rice Creek Commons, a new development. We're very fortunate to have a USGS stream gauge at the downstream end of our project for stream flow data, and that's also where the sediment data were collected. So I think it's really useful to look at the history of this site when we're talking about stream restoration design and how it's going to respond. So there's a history of channelization here. Prior to 1938, this is the first aerial photo. Presumably this was done for agricultural purposes. Now initially the floodplain remained intact. You can see that although the stream was channelized, the floodplain is still there. However, as we move forward in time into the 40s, the Twin Cities Army Ammunition Plant is constructed and we start to see fill coming in from the south and the east, filling in those floodplain areas and further straightening the creek. As we move forward through time, we see Rice Creek just kind of further settling into that new channelized pattern, more fills being brought in from the south and the east, until we get forward to present day. And here's where our meander project is starting to take shape. And I'll draw your attention, when this floodplain fill was brought in along the eastern side of the creek, it moved the creek up against some high banks in some places. So no longer was the creek flowing through the middle of the floodplain, but now flowing up against these high banks, which is floodplain fill that was brought in. So the channelization that occurred on Middle Rice Creek decreased stream length and then increased sediment transport capacity or stream power. So that, along with changes in hydrology upstream, that is development, so more water, higher peak flows, more volume, those things together meant more erosion in the creek. And with the channel profile or the bed locked in place by a string of culverts, all of that extra stream power was exerted on the banks. So there's lateral migration, there's channel widening. So that means lots of sediment and nutrients going downstream to Long Lake. That's bad. We used the Bank Erosion Hazard Index tool to evaluate Middle Rice Creek and found that nearly 30% of the banks were at high or very high risk for erosion. So that's what started our project. So we know we had some issues with this site. Increased slope and stream power meant an unstable channel and lots of bank failure. We have lots of sediment and nutrient delivery to Long Lake. Long Lake is impaired for nutrients with severe algae blooms there. And there's really poor in-stream habitat as well. And in fact, Middle Rice Creek is listed as impaired for biota, both fish and invertebrates. So our goals for this project primarily are to decrease sediment and nutrient delivery to Long Lake. So it's trying to improve water quality in Long Lake. Doing that by moving the channels away from the high eroding banks, and then also increase stream length, decrease power so that we have less erosion happening in the creek. Secondarily, we want to work on improving in-stream habitat and restore floodplain connectivity. So let's talk a little bit about project design and construction. This was a typical photo of Middle Rice Creek prior to the project, where we had lateral migration exceeding sometimes 1.5 feet per year. So it's really moving laterally every year due to all of that extra stream power and that erosion. So the intention here is to leapfrog the natural succession. So when the creek was straightened over time, it will restore its own meanders. As we see in these aerial photos, this is not a meander restoration here. This is a natural channel succession that we're seeing in a different part of Rice Creek. So this may seem kind of like a good thing. It's restoring its own meanders. However, as you can imagine, as we're moving from this pattern to this pattern, there's a whole lot of sediment that's being mined out of the banks and then being transported downstream. So what we aim to do with this project is to jump forward to that stable channel pattern, except for without all the mess of sending the sediment and nutrient downstream the Long Lake. All right, so we aim to do this by restoring floodplain connectivity. We're going to do this by slightly raising the profile of the channel by installing grade control, like these rock veins that you see in the photo here. If you speak Rosgan or you're kind of into the Rosgan language, we're moving from an unstable F channel to a more stable C channel. Going to be increasing the cross-sectional area slightly, and of course flattening out the slopes of the banks a bit. So the construction of this project happens in 2 phases. The first phase is the excavation of the new meanders. So that's what we see in like the top part of the photo here. But then those meanders would be left offline for a full year for vegetation to establish. And then phase 2, the next year, would be bringing these meanders online and then filling in the old channel. So that was the plan. It didn't work out that way because while this project was underway, we had high flow in Rice Creek for several years. It was just stuck in high flow. So we were quite concerned about bringing the new channel online during such high flows. Luckily, our grant timeline allowed us to push the project a full year. So phase 2 was pushed out into year 3. So that allowed a lot more time for vegetation to establish. And it was kind of a blessing in disguise, actually, because what we had when we brought the new channel online was very well-established vegetation. We had to use far less erosion control blanket because we pushed it a full year, so there's some cost savings there. So it actually worked out quite well. We were lucky to have a grant timeline that allowed that. Here's kind of an at-stream view of some of that native vegetation that was restored and was really fully established by year 3. So I'll show you here just a couple of sites during construction. These are 2 different sites, photos during phase 1 and phase 2. So phase 1 is on the left, that's the construction of the new channel. Phase 2 is on the right, that's the filling of the old channel. Now, to the untrained eye, I'm kind of joking here, but this may look like wetland impact, floodplain filling, or the complete filling of a navigable channel of a water of the United States, which of course would be a regulatory problem. But in fact, what you're seeing is a no net loss of wetlands, and those wetlands have a functional improvement. We documented that with the MinRAM process. Also, we were able to utilize a regional general permit with the Army Corps of Engineers. It was Regional General Permit I that allowed many of these activities. Now, before you go writing down Regional General Permit I, I'm sorry, it doesn't exist anymore. That's too bad. But I've heard that the Army Corps is working on a new regional general permit, so hopefully future projects like this will be allowable in the new regulatory framework. So just a quick note on costs. Our construction costs, just shy of $500,000 for construction. I think engineering and everything else brought the total cost of the project to a little over $600,000. And that's for over 4,000 linear feet of new restored channel. So now I'll get into some of the monitoring results. I think there's some interesting stuff here. So first off, I'll talk a little bit about the channel response. So we noticed some real changes in floodplain connectivity. That's been great. We also documented changes in the cross-section before and after the project with cross-section surveys. And then we worked with USGS to do suspended sediment and bedload monitoring, which has really been interesting. So in addition to being able to move the channel away from these high banks and create a more stable channel pattern, the project also restored floodplain wetlands, which improved habitat. So this was the original straightened channel, again flowing up against those high banks, which was then filled as we brought the new restored channel away from those high banks. But then that area, which you can see along the right-hand side of the photo, this was the straightened channel before, is now an off-channel floodplain. So water doesn't flow through it anymore, but it's a nice adjacent floodplain wetland with some really nice habitat in there for reptiles, amphibians, fish, inverts, which are listed as impaired. So there's kind of a stream level view of nice native vegetation in those floodplain wetlands. So the cross-section surveys, this stuff is pretty interesting. We had 14 cross-section surveys that we did before the project came online. So in 2016, this is post-construction. The channels are there, but they haven't come online yet. So it's kind of like an as-built survey. And then 2 years later, water is flowing through those new channels for 2 years. We come back and we survey them again to see how they're changing with all that water flowing through them. So we did the survey work with standard survey equipment. We also had to use a USGS acoustic Doppler profiler. That's what you see in the lower photo there. And we had to do that because flow was so high again on Rice Creek that many parts of it weren't wadeable. So that was kind of an interesting way to collect the data. So we're going to look at a couple different cross sections here. And really what you're looking at is a cutout of the creek, right? Looking down the creek. So there's the channel bed right here. So what we're looking at now with these circles is 2016. This is right after the project is completed, but before water is brought online. And then 2 years later, we can overlay the channel again. So what we're seeing here is actually a fair amount of aggradation, some filling of this channel. And in fact, this was a net loss of about 22% of the cross-sectional area, which is interesting. We have a highly mobile fine sand bed here. But it's good to see that the top of banks are not moving. So the channel is not moving laterally, it is stable, but inside the channel, below bankfall, we have lots of shifting. Let's look at another site. Again, here's right after the project is done, but before water's flowing through it, and there's 2 years later. This is a pretty major shift. So lots of things happening in the channel down below the bankfall elevation. Again, top of bank is not changing. The channel is stable. It's not migrating laterally, but below bankfall, we have lots of shifting. And here we actually had an increase in channel cross section by about 9%. One more. This is a pretty big shift. Lots of aggradation in this section. And actually, we lost about 28% of the channel cross section. And, you know, when we first did these, these were a little bit alarming. You know, this is some major changes. But again, we're satisfied that the top of bank is not moving. The channel is stable, but there's lots of changes in sedimentation rates through the channel here. Here's kind of an example of sediment piling up along one side of the channel. So this type of, I think this type of deposition has been fairly common throughout this reach. And this has resulted in a slightly reduced width depth ratio. So it's kind of moving from a C channel toward an E channel. But here's the summary. You know, this was a dynamic sandbag system, and we used a relatively soft restoration approach, and we're not armoring the whole thing, so we expect it to change. We did have consistent high flows from construction through present, really. So I think some of those changes have occurred faster than we expected. But importantly, we're not seeing lateral migration. The channel is not eroding and moving in one direction or the other. But below bankfall, we're seeing lots of changes, mainly so far aggradation. So over the entire channel, it's about an average of loss of 9%. And when you calculate that out, actually, that 9% of aggradation equates to about 2,000 cubic yards of sediment that were being captured by this new channel. So that's some evidence that, at least in the short term, the channel is capturing sediment. Now let's talk a little bit about that suspended and bedload sediment. This is work that USGS did for us, some really interesting stuff. Here was the conceptual model of how I hoped this monitoring program would work. If there was a relationship between flow and suspended sediment, we had a curve pre-project. Well, post-project, shouldn't we see that curve change and shift downward. So for a given flow, we'd see less suspended sediment moving through it. Well, unfortunately, this didn't work out, or at least it hasn't worked out yet. And there's several reasons for this. One is that the pre-project streamflow was far less than the post-project streamflow, so the data sets are fairly incompatible. Probably most importantly, though, is that in Rice Creek, there's a very poor relationship between suspended sediment and flow, and many other things. I'll show you this plot in just a second, and you'll see it. We also had some confounding variables here. I'll mention the confounding variables really quickly before talking about the other things. There was our project area, and at the same time during the project, there was some other construction work that was happening with the Rice Creek Commons development. And I think despite their best efforts for sediment control, there's probably some sediment releases here, and this was upstream of our monitoring location. So that was a little bit of a confounding variable. I mentioned there's this poor relationship between flow and suspended sediment. That is not a great R-squared value. This is not a very tight relationship. When we plot post-project on there, so pre-project is blue, post-project is green, there's just not much of a difference. It's kind of a scatter shot. So this poor relationship between suspended sediment and flow has made it difficult to evaluate. Again, as I mentioned, post-project flows were quite a bit higher, so that made those data sets somewhat incompatible. Now we did see, this is a little bit encouraging, we do see that post-project, the green line here, we see a decreasing slope, or a negative slope in fine suspended sediment as flow goes up. So this was something that we were hoping for as we move the channel away from those high banks, that we wouldn't get the fine sediment off of those high banks in the creek. So we could be seeing some positive benefits there. So kind of to sum up here, we had some difficult site conditions with really high flow, but we have a really successful meander restoration here. We have a new stable channel pattern that's away from those high eroding banks, and we've done a good job restoring connectivity to the floodplain wetlands. Now we've had a really difficult time detecting changes in sediment transport with that USGS work, but I think that's more of a statistical issue than an actual real issue. Because our cross-section surveys suggest that in fact we are capturing sediment, at least in the short term, about 2,000 cubic yards. Of course, long term, we hope that the site to just be stable, sediment in equals sediment out, but the banks shouldn't be a source of sediment downstream. We also see that the new cross sections are very dynamic. We have a natural channel, but with greatly improved habitat. Kind of just one final note, I think there's this idea in stream restoration that working in a low slope system is maybe a little bit forgiving, a little bit easier to work in. But in these fine sand systems like Rice Creek, even though it's low slope and relatively low power, that bed is so mobile that you have to be ready for that. You have to be ready for the stream to move. And the idea is not to lock it in place, but to create a new stable channel pattern. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. And if there are time for questions, there is a chat function in the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom window, and thank you very much for joining me.